punctual person, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Bob and Amy still have some health issues, and so they are unable to join us. I've just started recording. All right. So welcome to the last session for Learning and Retirement 219, Intro to Biblical Lit. We have been meeting every Monday from 6 to 7:30 Eastern Time. This is our last meeting. We skipped a day. And as I've said before, if you get dropped off, there's my number at the bottom. And you can also email ilr@frederick.edu. So tonight we're talking about Revelation, both as a genre and also the last book of the Christian Bible. And the Apocalypse, the last book of the Bible is sometimes called the Revelation or Apocalypse of John. And that is a Greek word, apocalypsis, that comes from these two words, apo, meaning to undo or move away from, and kalupto, which means to cover. So it's taking away a cover, it's uncovering, it's revealing. And it appears in very interesting ways. So for example, in 1 Samuel, the word is used and translated as nakedness. There's some brouhaha between Saul and David, and his mother's nakedness is referred to as apocalypsis. And so as a flexible term, it also appears in the second chapter of Luke's Gospel when St. Simeon utters what Catholics call in Latin the Nunc Dimittis. Let me close that down. And Simeon was an old man who was kind of hanging out at the temple in his old age, and he was promised in a revelation, a dream from God, that he would not die until he saw the Messiah of God. And so he says, as he sees Mary and Joseph bring Jesus into the temple on the 8th day, and he says, "Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace." And these are Latin words, now, letting, making this an incipit, a nunc dimittis. "According to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation that you've prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation," or apocalypsis, "to the Gentiles, and for glory to your people Israel." And that is St. Simeon's prayer of thanksgiving to God. And one of the only places where apocalypsis, it may actually be the only appearance, the only appearance of apocalypsis in the Gospels. Everywhere else that we find this word are either in the Petrine letters, epistles of 1st and 2nd Peter, or in Saul's letters. And I won't list them all, but he does talk about it quite a bit, apocalypsis or revelation. I will say, as an eternal skeptic, that he is probably always he's always reminding people of his credibility by saying, look, Jesus was revealed to me in Revelation, in a dream and a vision, and that is his ticket to credibility. So he talks it up quite a bit. We know of Revelation probably in this last book of the Bible, the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So this is the opening line of the Revelation of John, or the apocalypsis of John. It's usually translated Revelation, which I have here, and it's an incipit, just like the Nunc Dimittis. Apocalypsis is the first Greek word of this. It poses itself as a letter, and it's addressed to 7 churches, but it isn't actually a letter, but we'll get into the content of it momentarily. It is addressed to 7 churches in Asia Minor: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. If I had time, I would have combined this map with the map from last week with Saul's churches. And you'll notice that the addressees of most of the New Testament come from Asia Minor, the Greek peninsula, and then Rome. Very few are addressed to anybody in and around Israel. So Revelation as a genre is not just about uncovering secrets like KFC's 11 herbs and spices. It's actually about breaking down the barrier between the heavens and earth, between humanity and God. John, who's also called the seer in the context of Revelation, is not just doing apocalypsis. He's also doing this thing called eschatology. In fact, that's most of what John is doing in his letter, or letters, I suppose. One letter to rule them all, maybe. The word apocalypsis only appears in the first verse of this letter, making it an incipit, but it's misleading, as I said, because it's the only place it appears, and that's not all that he's doing. The word eschatos, meaning furthest, occurs 7 times in John's letter, and one that you'll hear over and over again. And depending on the translation, it makes an appearance in the first chapter, but near the end is the one that is pretty consensus. There's several places in Revelation where I'm the first and the last, the beginning and the end is like plugged in. So for example, the King James Version, chapter 1, verse 11, plugs it in there before he introduces the churches. But most of the historically reliable manuscripts we have don't have it there. So certain translators, certain communities and traditions emphasize the first and the last more than others. And I'm sure I mentioned last week about Terry Jenkins and Tim Delahaye, who wrote the Left Behind series based almost entirely on Revelation, John's Revelation, and takes it literally. And it's really interesting where they take that. But some traditions do emphasize the end times a lot more than others. I don't need to go into too much, but this has always been the case. In the first century, the Essenes were one of the 4 political parties that Josephus identifies and that we know existed. And they took the end times and being set apart and waiting for the end times very literally. As we'll see in a moment, eschatology was kind of new right around the 2nd and 3rd century BCE. And it hit kind of its zenith around John's Revelation, at least with the Western world. But for the Hebrew Bible, it's not as big of a deal. Even though even though John is doing both, there is a fine distinction between eschatos and apocalypsis. And I meant to come back. The few texts that are both are Daniel, which we'll talk about, parts of Daniel, and John's Revelation, and then little bits and pieces of Jesus's ministry in the Gospels, which we won't talk about in very much depth at all. We'll get into John's eschaton soon, but first let's reveal the true nature of apocalyptic literature and its precedent in the Hebrew Bible. So apocalyptic literature is a subset of prophecy insofar as it relies upon a claim of direct divine inspiration. This is a credibility issue, just like Saul is always claiming revelation. In order to gain credibility, an easy route to credibility is to say, well, God told me so, right? And this is just a human thing. If we get backed into a corner, we sometimes say, well, God made me do it, or God told me, and it's just hard to argue, right? And so in history, it's the same thing. Just like ancient readers and writers didn't have a huge problem with somebody else writing under a more influential person's name, to lend credibility to your writing, you would say, well, what I am writing is inspired by God. So the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible reflect a variety of literary styles, including historical narrative, oracular utterances. That's when in like Revelations or a revelation, a vision, Those are oracular. You might say an oracle is, like I talked about, how prophecy is kind of like saying, there's a baby at the top of the stairway. That baby's going to fall and get hurt. That's not so much predicting the future as it is reading the tea leaves. So oracular utterances are those prophetic words or deeds that seem to predict the future and might, but they're not purely revelatory. They aren't dependent entirely on divine inspiration. And then you also have some pseudo-epistolatory address to and from Yahweh in the prophetic literature as well. Apocalypse makes up a fraction of that prophetic literature, and a late adaptation at that. True revelation includes an overt indictment upon the world of its audience and an expectation of communal repentance. The call stories of the prophets can be called revelatory, but they come off almost as theatrical, containing no call upon the lives of its readers, or almost none. Take Isaiah 6, for example. It's a story that lends credibility to the prophet. It's apocalyptic, but it's not necessarily eschatological. Isaiah's call story occurs in chapter 6. It's one of the few or the only prophets that don't open his book with his call story. And he says, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and the train of his robe, which you can see wrapping around the pillars in here, the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. There's four in this image. And this image was in my seminary when I'd always get to look at it as we were doing lecture. And the seraphim flew to me, Isaiah, having in his hand a burning coal, which you can see down here in red, that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And it goes on, Isaiah says, woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I'm from a land of people of unclean lips. And so the seraphim, the angel, the messenger of God, touches this hot coal to his lips, cleanses his lips, and then the angel says, okay, now you can speak on my behalf because your lips have been cleansed. So this is apocalyptic. This is a vision that is being, that the prophet is seeing, relaying to his audience, but it has nothing to do with the end times. It's just a disclosure of God by the prophet. That's what I mean when we say apocalypsis, disclosing, unveiling the true nature of the cosmos, right? In the Hebrew and Christian imagination, that's God. And so he sees this huge temple, and the train, the end of the coat of God is kind of like wrapping around, and he has these angels flying all around that are covering their eyes, covering their feet, and flying. It's all these really highly symbolic, but also relatively realistic, that may not be the best word, but it's not hyperbolic, right? It's a metaphor, but it's relatively believable within the imagination of the Bible. Now Isaiah can be traced all the way back to about the 8th century BCE, so it's pretty old. We'll also discuss Ezekiel, which was composed probably in the 6th century BCE. Now apocalypses are visions that defy natural phenomenon, but they're not inherently eschatological. Yeah, Cap.
You talk about the book of Isaiah. There is first Isaiah and second Isaiah. So there are two different Isaiahs writing in two different time periods for verses in chapter 6, and then of course the verses in chapter 2, verses 2 to 4, which define what the future would look like in a world in which God took over, at least for Jews. I believe those are both first Isaiah. Second Isaiah is later on in the book and has somewhat different visions.
Yeah, so there are pieces of eschatology in the prophets, but few of them take the time to build elaborate structures, theological, rational structures around that vision. Isaiah 2 and Micah 4, the lion shall lay down with the lamb, you will not study war anymore. Those are end times. It does not exist right now, but the prophet sees a time in which that will be possible, if not present. But the hope remains a kind of kernel in their writing, whereas we'll see in Daniel and in John's Revelation, it's almost the entire thing. And that's what I mean when I say eschatology, a whole structure to that proposes a complex and rationally coherent image of what this will be after or when we don't study war anymore, when the lion lays down with the lamb and the wasp with the adder or something like that. But good point. In other words, in where are we? Ezekiel, we shouldn't equate apocalypse with end times. Rather, the Hebrew Bible and its imagination did not, until more recently, believe that Yahweh intended or was interested in ending the world to save it, as some Christian traditions propose. Whereas many of the Hebrew prophets can trace their origins to long before the composition of the Septuagint in the 3rd century BCE, those that were distinctively eschatological have a shorter track record. And here we have Ezekiel with a revelatory vision. A stormy wind came out of the north and a great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually. From the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces and each of them had 4 wings. It goes into greater detail in a couple verses later. Each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side. The 4 had the face of an ox on the left side and the face of an eagle. And then it begins with a human face. You can kind of see it in this smaller inset here. These are not the same depictions, but I thought it was interesting because they kind of give some detail to what it might look like. And so these living creatures make appearances elsewhere. Other prophets lend their pen to this imagery, and as we'll see, it gets borrowed in eschatologies like Daniel. The earliest apocalyptic eschatology is found in the book of Daniel, a pseudographical text written in probably the 2nd century BCE. So that's 2 centuries before 0. So it's very close to 1st century Palestine. And I posted this little graphic because I'm interested in the background of end times theology or eschatology is what is ending and why, who calls for it, who benefits for this thing to end, and does it really represent the end, or is it kind of, circling back on itself and becoming the beginning? We've heard, there's this like cultural thing of like this guy with the little sandwich board saying the end is near or the end is nigh, which is Scots for here, right? The end is here. And I found this one I thought was kind of funny that, there's this old gentleman, the end is near, and a person of color coming from around the bend saying, actually, this is just the beginning. Who benefits from eschatology? What social location does eschatology arise from? Daniel begins his story. It's just 12 chapters long, and it's broken into 2 parts. And scholars believe the first part may have been a very old story or series of stories about this legendary figure who was mentioned elsewhere. But the second half, chapter 7 through 12, makes a distinct change in direction. It goes from these narrative stories about living in the court of Darius or Nebuchadnezzar, I can't remember, to this eschatology that Daniel shares in his writing. And the Hebrew Bible places Daniel with the Ketuvim, the writings, rather than the prophets. And that's probably because it's so late. The scholars date this portion of Daniel to the 2nd century BCE because eschatologies just weren't that popular. I'm sure there's all kinds of studies and research about why they were popular, but it wasn't just Daniel that did this. There were Persian eschatologies, Greek, Roman, Median, it was just a thing. For a couple of centuries, they were very popular to imagine what the end times would be like. And Daniel is Hebraic perspective on the end times. It appears to have been written very late for that reason, and it also seems to have been written by two different authors. The narrative pieces are written largely in Aramaic, which is also a very late development linguistically. The eschatology piece, chapters 7 through 12, are largely written in Hebrew, which may be an attempt to connect the eschatology with the priestly tradition and again lend credence to it, or it may just not mean much of anything. But the Aramaic in the early parts of Daniel are noteworthy, and it may have been that this the eschatological piece of it took shape first, and then the author, the community that authored Daniel, went around collecting these 6 stories that make up the first 6 chapters of Daniel. Daniel's name, Daniel, means God is my judge. And the second part, chapter 7 through 12, veer heavily toward hyperbolic symbolism to describe the imminent destruction of the world. And that is one of the unique features of Daniel. You might think of like Jonah, where he's sent to prophesy against Nineveh, but that threatened destruction was just one little piece of the world. Daniel and eschatologies in general are concerned with the entire world, even if it wasn't all known. It's not just our enemies, but it's also everything that we know of. Everything's going to get turned over, and God is going to put something new in its place. So after the first 6 chapters of narrative, the text in Daniel describes 4 beasts of the sea. These are kingdoms set up against the holy ones of Israel, according to one of the prophet's attendants. So the eschatologies in general will often include the recipient, the witness to the vision. There will be maybe a divine voice, or something purely divine. And there's often an interpreter present, whether that's an angel, or in the first little section of Daniel, it's one of Daniel's court attendants who interprets these 4 beasts. Then after these 4 beasts of the sea comes a ram and a goat, which the angel Gabriel explains are the Medes, Persians, and Greeks. Next comes a vision of 70 weeks of years, or 490 years, when Gabriel says the temple will be in ruins. And then finally, a war between the north and the south is described, and it's the conclusion in war is also very often typical of eschatologies. And I've highlighted the animals here because they seem to be a recurring theme. There's a lion, and it's real weird. The lion with eagle's wings, the bear, which you can see has 3 ribs in its mouth, a leopard, which is missing 2 of the 4 wings, and then a 4th beast that isn't really described, other than that it's exceedingly strong and dreadful, has a number of horns. And so some people depict it as a dinosaur. I've seen a dragon, but it doesn't say what kind of beast it is. But there's 4 of them, and they are called the beasts of the sea. So let's return to John's revelation. And it draws heavily upon these earlier apocalyptic and eschatological literature of the Bible. After addressing the 7 churches and sharing a little bit about what they're doing wrong and how they could improve, we move into the eschatology of John. He launches into his vision, which seems to derive a lot from earlier prophetic literature, beginning with the 4 throne-bearing beasts from Ezekiel. And I've got both of them here. Uses a human, lion, ox, and eagle. And in John, the order is different, but the animals are exactly the same. And he does this to set up the end of the world, he uses Ezekiel's creatures to set up the end of the world. Ezekiel doesn't really said, the world is just a revelation of God. John uses those same animals, which bear the throne of God. And there's like these weird wheels. It's called the chariot literature. It's very, very complex. And Christians have used these same creatures to depict the evangelists. And I think we talked about this. Mark is the lion. Luke is the ox, Luke Acts. Matthew is the angel or the human. And then John is the eagle. In Judaism, however, they can often be attributed to 4 biblical archangels. Michael is the lion, Uriel is the ox, Raphael is the human, and Gabriel is the eagle. So again, these 4 creatures, lion, ox, human, and eagle, are recurring themes in the Christian Hebrew Bible. And then it gets real wacky. And I'm going to focus in on just one of the ones that I think makes the most common recurrence in kind of contemporary culture, and that's these 4 horsemen, which come very quickly after the 7 churches are addressed. Then a 7-horned, 7-eyed lamb who looks as though it had been slain is given a scroll with 7 seals that imply pending global destruction. It's not quite destruction yet, but there's things to come that should worry us. First, there are 4 mysterious colored horses or horsemen, which you might have heard labeled as death, famine, pestilence, and war. And I couldn't figure out which one was which. And that should be clue to us that it's not really biblical. It just kind of, well, it is, but we'll see how it has kind of gotten adapted. The death, famine, pestilence, war is not New Testament. I'm sorry. But it does come from the Bible. At least in Revelation, the white horseman is given a bow and crown and is given authority or instructions to conquer. The red horseman is given a sword to steal peace from the world. The black horse is given scales, and he's quoted as basically measuring things out, but it's not said exactly what he's doing. He's certainly judging, but Revelation doesn't get explicit. And then finally, the pale horse is called death, and Hades or hell follows closely behind it, and they are given authority to kill. I want to say like a quarter of the earth or something. And so these are according to Revelation 6, these are what the 4 horses do. Different people have interpreted them differently, whether the white horse is like Roman imperialism and prosperity, because white is supposed to be clean and powerful. White war horses are supposed to be, regnal. Kings use white horses. The red has been, disease, perhaps, because it's for a lot of disease in the ancient world, you would bleed like the Black Plague. You'd like bleed from your eyes. But there's no one way to interpret this, that the 4 horsemen, through a Christian lens. However, the eagle-eyed interpreter will see that this is not just random, attribution of, woes, death, famine, pestilence, and disease. And they're not unique to Revelation either. They're borrowed from Zechariah 6. Zechariah 6 uses colored horses pulling chariots that go out to the 4 winds of heaven after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. Sees this big mountain and these chariots with horses, 2 horses each coming down. And the first chariot has red horses. We don't know the destination of the red horses. The red horsed chariot isn't given. Next, we have black horses, which go north. Third, we have white horses that also go north after the black horses. And then finally, there are dappled horses with spots, and they go south. And north seems to be a good thing, because immediately after, in like verse 10 or something, it talks about how the Spirit of the Lord will rest in the north country, something like that. So it seems as though black and white are both good. The red horse is like, I don't know, something. And then the dappled horse, which goes south, maybe a symbol of like the opposite of good, the opposite of the north, could be hell. I don't know. But there again, there's millions of interpretations for this. If you're wondering where the labels of death, famine, pestilence, and war come from, it might be from later Christian interpretations of Ezekiel 14, chapter 21. How much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 disastrous acts of judgment: sword, famine, wild beasts, and pestilence, not famine, to cut off from it man and beast. So Ezekiel 14 has 3 of these, doesn't have famine, it has wild beasts, but these are the 4 disastrous acts of judgment, which may be where Christians got it. They also maybe coupled it with Ezekiel 6:12. He who is far off shall die of pestilence, he who is near shall fall by the sword, and he who is left is preserved and shall die of famine. So here you can see what these 4 horsemen may have been, right? Between Ezekiel, Zechariah, and Revelation. Whether the pale horse, whether that dappled or not, but you can see where this is coming biblically and how John may be incorporating these ancient symbols into his own eschatology. Any questions on any of this so far? We'll keep it short tonight because it's the last one I want to discuss, but I wanted to hear if anybody read anything or heard anything that you have any questions or thoughts on the 4 horsemen, because they're such a prominent symbol.
Well, it's not exactly about the 4 horsemen, just a question about the John in Revelation. Is that John the evangelist who wrote the gospel?
With most of they're called Johannine epistles and gospel, there is not a consensus. It is credible that the Apostle John wrote the gospel, the epistles, and Revelation. It's possible. Most scholars don't think it's likely, in part because 2nd and 3rd John and 1st John seem kind of different. They don't seem very uniform. And so that's like the first salvo. If you're critical of whether or not John wrote them all, that's probably your go-to, is look, the letters don't match, and so why would any of them match? The timing, however, does seem to match up. What we know of the historical situation and the clues that are given in the Johannine literature all place it within a couple of decades toward the end of the 1st century, between the 85 and 100. They could all foreseeably have been written in that time span. We know that there was someone that was exiled on Patmos. We know that this letter got out, but whether or not it was the apostle is it's not certain, but it is likely, which I still find fascinating, to be honest. I think it would be great if he did, but we don't. It's really hard to know for sure.
I think I saw something that said that one of the things that was kind of interesting between, I guess, the Gospel of John, I'm not sure about the letters, and the Revelations document, was that they used the same terminology for the Christ figure, like Word of God and stuff like that, which is sort of unique to John in the Gospels. So that was an argument, I guess, on the side of maybe it is the same person. Yeah,
so one way that scholarship has dealt with that is to use the language of a authorial community. That a letter, the gospel, Revelation, began as a core document by somebody, and then the community that identified most closely with those documents became the community by which those documents were preserved, edited, adapted, and updated. And so that's what you may see in scholarly articles, the Johannine community or the Markan community. The what they mean by that is once you say have the gospel, let's say the gospel you have first, just as an example, and you notice that, yeah, Jesus is referred to as the Word of God. It's not unforeseeable that somebody entirely different can then adopt that same language right under John's name, mimic his style, and not be John, but still be Johannine. And so, yes, the Word of God is distinctly Johannine, and the Johannine literature is also very spiritual, symbolic. There are no parables in John, or depends how you define parable, but John's gospel is not interested in the kind of quirky, real life, kind of fingernails dirty kind of activity that, say, Mark is. Like Mark is where we find that Jesus takes some dirt, spits on it, rubs it around, puts it on someone's eyes, and says, you're healed. Like John just has too high of a view of Christ to tolerate that kind of behavior. So it's foreseeable that there was a person that wrote all of these, and there was a community, today we'd call it a platform or an audience, a following, that said, these are great. We're gonna make sure these get passed around. We're gonna keep them. We're gonna, give them out as tracts and hope other people feel similarly. But we ultimately can't know for sure. But we also cannot discount the idea that there was one author who was present for some of these events.
Is it known who sent him to Patmos?
Not for sure. Remember that in the first century, if you're Jewish if you're sympathizing with Jews, like the destruction of the temple is huge. That hasn't happened since Babylon. Like there's no temple. We can't sacrifice. That's a big deal. Christian or people who were following Jesus and increasingly Paul had an answer for that. And we can talk about Paul all day, but so after the temple was destroyed, the Jewish community within Rome still had a certain amount of clout with the Romans. And the Christians, or what became Christians, didn't have that same authority. So when there's these letters passed between governors, Pliny the Younger and Trajan, and it talks about, what should I do with these Christians? And it's later, but it's a good example of what happens after the temple is destroyed. The Jewish community still has some credibility with the Romans, but this new thing that came out of Judaism, Romans look at as a problem. Like, you don't have the same historical track record as Judaism, and through the first to about the 3rd century, Roman emperors were increasingly getting worried that the empire was declining because we weren't making the gods happy. And the Jewish community got a pass because they were so old, but Christians, which was originally a slur, it meant one who was owned by the Messiah, by this guy who was killed by the Romans. It was a slavery term. Christos was Greek, and Ionos, the suffix, was Latin, which meant someone who was a slave of someone else. And it actually makes an appearance in Acts, the community at Antioch, who had a reputation for giving nicknames. They gave the Christians their Christian name. So it's hard to identify who put John on Patmos, but the idea that there was someone who had some influence, who maybe they didn't want to kill, because crucifixion was very popular. They used it to great effect, but you could also, I can't remember what the saying was, but if you make someone a martyr, if you kill them, you make them a martyr, but if you make them go away, they're forgotten. So that it's possible that this figure John was making trouble by preaching the gospel, just like Paul was, and whoever had John in their jurisdiction said, well, I don't want to make you a martyr. I'm just going to put you on Patmos and you're just going to rot away there. The oral tradition is that he's the only apostle who wasn't martyred. And there's this story about how they dipped him in burning oil and he came out without a scratch. And so he was also the youngest apostle. And so there's all kinds of stories, but no, we don't know who put him in exile, but we do know that there's good reason. People who are problems to Romans could very easily be exiled in lieu of being executed. Long answer, sorry, to a short question, but no, we don't know, but it's perfectly within the historical record that someone that either couldn't be killed, according to oral tradition, or who just you may not want to make them a martyr, you just get them away from people. And so I'll come back to Revelation, one facet of the historical or scholarly debate is like, why did he write so over the top with hyperbole? Exceeds Daniel in like just weird stuff. Well, maybe because if he's in a prison colony, he's allowed probably to write letters, but Romans don't want him building his influence. They don't want him building his followership, right? And so one of the avenues of debate or whatever is that he couched a letter to these 7 churches to say something that he couldn't say overtly. It's been a while since I read it, but some scholars, like historical critical scholars, will say, all this numerology and, the beast and the Antichrist, like these are all very new to the biblical tradition. But maybe this individual is saying, Nero, who ostensibly caught something on fire in Rome, and then to avert blame, he blames the Christians. Peter and Paul then are martyred under that persecution. Maybe he doesn't want to piss off Nero, but he wants to say, look, Nero is the embodiment of the Antichrist. The numbers of his name spell out 666. The mark of the beast was maybe how you would implant or affix the emperor's face on the back of coins. We still do that. Like now that Charles is king, all of Queen Elizabeth's faces on the coins are getting cycled out. Now it's King Charles. So it's like we're still doing it. But one of the kind of areas of debate is like, is there some historical story that John is telling that he can't tell out in the open? So he does so through incredibly coded language. Nero is the Antichrist, and there was a belief among Romans that Nero would return and all this fun, weird stuff. So the historical, debate or commentary and scholarship is a whole thing with John. But yeah, the symbols and the hyperbole are really hard to track, and I summarize it in the next slide, but it doesn't do it justice. Anybody else? I just had one last slide, just a couple of visuals that I think are important to talk about, and that is once the horsemen are just kind of the vanguard or the warning signs of things to come. What really goes on in Revelation are these 7 trumpets, which mirror the plagues of Passover in that they usher in death and destruction upon the world. The final 3 trumpets are also woes. Then you have 7 bowls, which add insult to injury. They're more trials and tribulations. And then his eschatological apocalypse concludes with a great wedding feast of this 7-eyed, 7-horned, slain lamb. And his wedding feast inaugurates a new Jerusalem that closes the Christian Bible where it began, with God and humanity in a verdant paradise where the sun never sets, the streets are paved with precious stones and metals, and God wipes away our tears right there with us. God is with us in the New Jerusalem, just as God was with us in Eden. Its dimensions make it a perfect cube, just like the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. There is no temple or place of worship other than God himself and the slaughtered lamb, who reside kind of at the middle of the New Jerusalem. There is no sea. Remember the salty chaos of Genesis. There's only a river flowing with the water of life, and humanity has restored access to the tree of life, whose 12 fruits bloom every month, and whose leaves are for the healing of nations. The biblical utopia represents an everlasting life for those who endure the trials of worldly experience. The gates never close, and there are guardians, and there's, in Revelation, there's, just like in Joshua, at the end of the military campaign, it says, but there's more that had to be done, and we didn't conquer it all. In Revelation, the dragon, the beast, which is the accuser, he's shut up into the earth for 1,000 years, and he'll be let out again, and he'll be finally destroyed. But it's this weird cyclical thing that the end is really a beginning, and even that beginning is not. It gets weird. But I think I'll leave it at that, because the imagery is just hard to kind of hard to dismiss. And that is, wait, how do I stop sharing? Resume share. How do I, well, anyway, that is everything I've got. Eschatology is, stop share. Eschatology is just a whole world. It also happens to be the end of the Christian Bible and the end of our course. I'm sorry, Bob and Amy couldn't make it, but now that we are at the end of the course, I'd love to hear if you have questions, things that struck you. I was going over old slides, and I think I may have promised them. I'll make sure you have those, this presentation as well as last presentation. But does anybody have any closing thoughts, commentary, questions?
Question. I have a question.
Sure.
In the book of Revelation, does it say that the Jews have to be in control of Israel, or they're in Israel, in order for the book of Revelations to happen? Because many Jews, the reason the evangelicals support Israel so strongly is because they believe that the book of Revelation can't come true without the Jews being in possession of Israel. Can you speak on that?
Not authoritatively. One of the complicating factors with, as we've discussed, like the Johannine literature, John is very polarizing is kind of a really strong word, but it may be appropriate. John sees what's going on with between the Christian and Jewish community, and he is very much, Paul has a theology behind it. The apostles of the Gentiles, and he has, an explanation for how and why this all fits together. Hebrews is drawn from Saul's theology, but John just kind of takes, John strikes me as like the proto-evangelical. Right now, evangelical typically means conservative Christian. When I
would
read
argue
John,
it means white Christian nationalists, but that's a political thing.
yes, I think there is a strong loyalty to nationalism within the evangelical movement. We used to call them the moral majority, and now evangelical is like the next, title. But in John, one of the things that I find confounding with John is he has a low view of almost everybody except the Christian community. That includes the Jews. And as a soldier, I notice when John, like when he describes the passion, he just says the soldiers killed Jesus. And the other, especially Luke nuances it quite a bit, because he's a Gentile, and he knows it's a little bit more complicated. John, everything's simple. You just need to follow Jesus, and this is, if you don't, then whatever, you're just not going to make it into heaven. So the eschatology that John or Revelation sets up is kind of confusing to me because John has such a low view of everybody outside his own community. So that 144,000 Jews are supposed to something, again, it's definitely not my wheelhouse, but I've come across enough, water cooler talk in Christianity that it just seems it seems like trying to butter both sides of your toast. And that's all, I don't know, that's all I guess I can say about it.
There is a part in there where the 144,000, I was just trying to find it, but I can't, of course, now that I want it. Where it's like 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, right, that are there with the Lamb, at the end, which may be the thing that the evangelicals have latched onto, that, Israel has to be unified in a coherent, strong state in order for the Lamb to, come back. So I'm thinking that's probably where they're getting that from, but
Yeah, there's
not being an evangelical, I don't know for sure.
there is definitely there is a system of reason around evangelical theology. I don't adhere to it, but it does attempt to make its own sense. So one of the paradox of Christianity is that, and I think Paul talks about being grafted onto the vine. You don't get Jesus but through Judaism. And Paul says, well, look, if you look at Judaism as the law and the law alone, you might miss the mark. John, or the Johannine literature, seems to, like the 12 times 12 is 144. You can't get away from Hebraic symbolism, meaning, scripture without, you cannot get rid of it, or you're going to wash the baby out with bathwater. And that isn't to say one thing or another, but I do see, like, borrowing from the Hebrew Bible, you have to do it. And you can either, in the early church, there's this guy Marcion, and it's the same basic belief still persists. Marcion said, oh, there's this angry, violent God in the Old Testament. We only need the New Testament. We only need the Gospels and the letters. And so Marcionism is the name that Christians, scholarly Christians, will give to this idea that we just need Jesus. I mean, that makes no sense to say it if you have any kind of biblical literacy, because Jesus inherits and embodies the entirety of Hebrew scripture. Like, there's no such thing as only Jesus. And yet we deal with these paradoxes in different ways. The evangelical instinct of, like, well, yes, it seems duplicitous. Israel is a state, but then it's going to get destroyed, and then Jesus is going to come in and vindicate all us Christians. I find that to be a very shaky, rational system. I don't know how powerful it really is, but it's certainly influential. I went to Israel, Palestine right after the military, and I got, a fire hose of that stuff, because I got out, wanting to be a Christian, and spent time with some Israelis who were very much willing to take evangelical Christian money, who were like, yeah, Israel's not going anywhere. So it's this weird relationship between evangelicalism and Judaism, frankly.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think that's part of the reason that the U.S. Embassy got moved to Jerusalem. It's
Yeah.
not that the former guy, the insurrectionist, was in any way, shape, or form a Christian, but the evangelical Christians wanted it moved, and he was appealing to a political base. It had nothing to do with religion.
Yeah.
So he tried to clothe it in a religious framework.
Yeah. Yep. Thinking about wider biblical literature in this course, I'm interested to hear what people went into the course thinking, expecting, hoping, whether that was touched on, or whether your impression of biblical literature has been affected, or if it was just kind of interesting to hear me talk for how many 8 sessions. I think we did 8 sessions.
I have read and taken classes in the synoptics. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John with Reverend Carl Gregg of Unitarian Universalist. And I've studied and read the Christian Bible, the Jewish Bible. I'm reading the Quran now. I did not know a lot about the letters and where they came from and who they were addressed to and how that whole structure was put together. So I did learn something in your class, Logan. I appreciate it.
Good. I'm glad. Can I squeeze John or Jean for any thoughts?
Well, I would say that one of the things that I was interested in always is the historical context. You know, what's going on in the world when these people are writing, you know, and what are they doing? What are the influences on them? Not only the traditional influences, but what new things are they trying to address, you know, through their prophecies, you know, and just through their the way they interpret the law and things like that in the Old Testament particularly. So I found some of that. We got some of that, which I found really interesting. I guess being, you know, interested in that historical angle to it, I would always like to see more. But it did give me a lot of food for thought and filled in a lot of things that the scholarship is a lot more current, you know, with you than what I had, you know, I don't want to say how many years ago, 50 years ago. So
Good. Johnny, you're popping up. Did you hit something?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was just hoping to learn more about some background information in the Bible and what have you. And that certainly, you certainly did that.
Good. Well, you all have me for another 30 minutes if we'd like to discuss or go over anything, but I'm also happy to close this chapter and of course invite you to my next class. I think it's February 6th, War in the Bible. And I'm actually really hoping to get into some of the historical stuff, Jean, through Josephus and Maccabees. It's going to be a little bit more in my wheelhouse. And it's something that I'm not sure that is really being done. Well, yeah, the historical stuff also definitely interests me, trying to get inside the minds as much as we can of the original authors and the community, and then how do we then interpret that for our own time.
I was
Are you going to
wondering,
use Karen Armstrong as one of the resources? Because Karen Armstrong's book, A History of Violence, looking at how the Bible has inspired violence throughout history, is a fascinating look at interpretations and total misinterpretations of biblical passages in biblical books.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. I've also read some of her stuff on the Crusades. I haven't looked at Fields of Blood, I think is the one I have in mind, but I am particularly interested.
That's it, Fields of Blood, great book.
Oh yeah. There's I'm really interested in how a lot of it intersects with the Bible. So I won't, like, peeling back the onion from modern war is less my concern than it is like assuming a biblical imagination. What is the army? What is a soldier? What do they do? What function do they play? And then how does war intersect? Like, it still fascinates me that the Gospels, Mark, the first one to be written, is right in the midst of the Great Revolt, which is this huge thing. And then the other Gospels are written later. The only thing we have pre-revolt is Paul. But, you know, war and violence intersects the scriptures so much. And we don't, the Maccabees is this intertestamental writing that is in some of the, you know, some apocryphal sections of some Bibles, but like, it's really interesting to think about. They have, you know, the history of Israel as a nation, as a people, and how that leads into this period with the Romans and how at that point it stratifies. But so it'll be a little bit of exegesis, a little bit of historical investigation, especially with Josephus, because Christians just don't read Josephus enough. But yeah, I'm really interested in that intersection, trying to get at somebody asked me, you know, what a pacifist, asked me one time, well, what does a pre-fall military look like? Like, what would it mean to have a biblical, understanding of maybe not violence, but service, and then kind of roll that out through the Bible, the Hebrew Bible and Christian New Testament, and kind of see where it goes. Gene, I thought I heard you about to say something. I'd love to
I
hear.
was just going to ask if you were going to address at all like the theological issues surrounding just war theory and things like that.
I definitely could. It seems like it's a distinct issue, and Kelly is taking class ideas for the fall. So that would be the earliest I could do it. But if I were to do it for war in the Bible, it would have to be kind of cursory. If you're interested, I think I have some stuff. Well, I don't know. I might have to take it down. I've given a course, like a workshop on it before. I can probably find it and share the link with you if it's just something you're interested in.
I would be interested in that.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that.
The other thing about war in the Bible, which I do have in my calendar for February as a class I'm interested in, would be, are you going to cover the anthropomorphic depictions of God as a soldier, as a warrior, where God is bearing weapons, or God is going to war, leading the army, and the Israelites are following behind? Much of the book of Joshua is really written as if God was a soldier on the battlefield with the armies from Joshua through Deborah, through all of that of the early books that follow the Torah. It's all God is a great soldier, and he's a great leader, and he's our general. And here are the anthropomorphic qualities of God that lead him to lead us.
Yeah, the academics call it the divine warrior motif. And I talked a little about the armor of God, which is probably the backbone of that debate. But there is also, like, when they're fighting the Amalekites in Genesis, Moses has the rod of God, and he has to have Aaron and Caleb maybe like hold his arms up so they keep winning. And as his arms get tired, they start losing. So there's all these, it's very interesting to think of not only God as one who participates, but also like how God enables national violence and what we can infer from that. For example, when Moses was up on the mountain coming down with Joshua, they hear a noise like war in the camp, and it's Aaron and the Israelites dancing around the golden calf. And I find that interesting that the military language is used. It's war because they are making war against Yahweh by worshiping this false god. And they come down, and the birth of the priest function of the Levites was to kill 3,000 of their own kinsmen. And so and I think a lot of Christians, I think how should I say this? I think there's a danger of possessing a religious belief and letting that religious belief inadvertently steer where you go with theology. So there's this really great resource. I've used them maybe early on in the class called the Bible Project. And they do short explainer videos, which are great. And the theology is really good. But if you look on their website for stuff like soldier, military, war, they avoid it because the main guy is like, I'm uncomfortable with this. And it's like, well, why should that stop you from studying it? And the flip side, I've seen too many really well-intentioned Christians who believe for very good reason in nonviolence just kind of cast a whole blanket of skepticism over anything and everything that they perceive as violent. It's like one guy who's a professor, I can't remember, Emory, he was talking about reading the Bible through a gendered lens or something. And as an aside, he said, well, some parts of the Bible, like the genocide of Canaan, like you just have to kind of put it on the side. And I'm like, what scholar just puts it on the side because they can't explain it? And frankly, the Bible does not describe it as genocide. Like that is us putting our insecurities onto the text, and then just it becomes this kind of feedback loop. We believe it because we don't study it, and we don't study it, so we believe this thing that isn't necessarily true. So my interest in the military and violence comes out of my personal experience, but I want to be on guard against leading with my beliefs. I believe in nonviolence, but that shouldn't, I think too often we don't want to have really good, engaging discussion about these uncomfortable texts, and enough people don't, expect us to, and so we don't. So I'm hoping that with this course, War in the Bible, I'm trying to let the Bible speak for itself. It won't. I mean, I'm going to speak on its behalf, but I really want to remain honest with that interpretation and do a better job than just kind of like, you'll hear me, talk about what kind of the consensus is as I've spoken now, and there really isn't a very strong critical consensus of some of these texts, other than to say, well, kind of this Marcionite, kind of like, well, he's just angry, and that's all we can take from it. I think there's more there, and I think we really need to kind of take a closer look. For me, it's about other military families wanting to feel like they belong in a faith that doesn't engage with these texts. But I think it's also, I think we learn about God when we are willing to examine the parts of God that we don't like. And violence is not something I like. I don't think anybody likes it, but we don't do ourselves any favors by not looking at it as fairly and as impartially as we can. And I think the Bible does say something about violence and about the military that kind of gets in between these kind of binary political expectations or whatever.
To me, the study of the Hebrew Bible and the study of history of the Middle East is that, at least through the Bible, wars are fought for territory, they're fought for tribute, they're fought for slaves. And in the case of much of the Israelite people, they're fought to hang on to whatever the practices in worship of Adonai are at the time, as opposed to Christian wars in later centuries and up to today, that in many cases are fought in order to forcibly convert people to a specific faith. The land and the gold were important to the Spanish, but equally important to the Spanish in conquering the New World was to win converts for God. The whole way in which the Aztec and Incan Empire were wiped out. Yeah, we wanted the gold, but anybody that was left had to become Catholic. It was absolutely the end result. After we got your gold, you better be Catholic. If you're not Catholic, you're dead. And in the Bible, at least in the Old Testament, I don't find any cases where it's, all right, we've conquered you, now you're all going to start worshiping Adonai, you're all going to become Jewish. It was, all right, we want to stop paying tribute because you've been making us pay tribute. We want you to pay tribute to us. We want your people for slaves, or we need this land and we're going to fight over the land. You do not see an imposition of religion and religious practices in the Bible, and you do see that strongly from Christianity, especially from Constantine on.
Yeah,
And
that's a good point.
Islam.
Yeah.
And Islam was the same way. Islam conquered the world of that time. And in some cases, it was forced conversion, but in many cases, especially once an Islamic empire got established, you could pay your zakat and you could live and practice your own religion, have your own clergy, do everything you wanted, as long as you were paying a tax overall to the rulers. And Judaism flourished in many of the Islamic communities. There was some that did forced conversion, but across most of the area that the Islamic Empire spread to, especially in the 800 through, I'd say 1400 Common Era, it was very common to find all different faiths being practiced within an Islamic empire without interference. And you did not have that in the Christian conquest. And part of the Crusades was to win back the Holy Lands from those that did not follow Jesus.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I left California when I entered the military, and I always felt like, and then I got to the East Coast and it's like, oh, all this history, it's great. And then I'm back in California. It's like, well, there's history. It's just not a history that we talk about, which is precisely what Cap was saying. Like, yeah, the Franciscans came in, and you were going to convert. Like, that's where the term neophyte in the Franciscan language came from. And there were 3 to 5 soldiers for every priest at each mission up and down the California coast. Like, it was an overt, explicit expectation or desire of those who went to war. But anyway, yeah, excellent points. Any last minute things? I will send out slides after this. I'll put the video up for Bob and Amy. I'm sorry we missed you if you're watching this long. But yeah, I really appreciate everybody showing up, and your questions have been great. And yeah, if there's anything I can ever do for you, let me know.
Happy Hanukkah, everybody, and Merry
Yes.
Christmas.
Happy holidays.
Same, happy
Thanks,
holiday.
Logan.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Logan.
Thanks,
Have a
Logan.
good
Happy
winter
holidays.
break.